Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Welcome again to In the Word, and we are studying the role of faith and people of faith and how faith has impacted the world, Christian faith. And we have been studying faith in the little wisdom book of James, and now we leave that behind and we go to the book of Acts and find there again another example of faith and faithfulness in the book of Acts in chapter 9. So Dave, we're changing gears here in terms of the type of literature we have.
Definitely.
And the story, now we have a record, a history, or historical kind of record, and we see it's a miracle story, and it involves Peter. And Peter, not in Jerusalem, but in the coastal area.
Mediterranean coast area.
Yeah, right. And so why don't we got to get back geared up for Peter instead of where we've been.
Right.
And so let's do that.
Yeah, Peter is the obviously prominent leader as the book of Acts begins. After Jesus ascends, and then the day of Pentecost, he's the spokesperson.
Well, he sort of was given, when Jesus tells him at the time of the Great Confession that I will give to you the keys to the kingdom, that is a kind of code way of saying, I'm going to make you the Lord Chamberlain. Because really in the Old Testament, when someone is given the key to the palace where the king lives, he is the equivalent of the prime minister or the chief spokesperson for the cabinet or for the Lord, So that is a way of saying that he is made by Jesus to be the chief spokesperson.
And that's obvious in the book of Acts. Of course, that's been carried pretty far by some Christians to the point of almost deifying Peter and his role. But he was the spokesperson. He was the one. He
was given the leadership role.
Yes, right.
And he's impetuous, but he seems to be everywhere, and he seems to be the one with the drive about him to take the lead in leading
He spoke up
after Jesus is gone.
As he and Peter and John were called before the Sanhedrin, he was able to speak up, and they were amazed that an uneducated man like him could speak that way, but they recognized he'd been with Jesus.
Right.
And that was his credential.
Yes. Isn't it interesting? It seems that, though, Peter and Andrew, brothers, and James and John, sons of Zebedee, it seems they must have been in some sort of a corporation, a fishing corporation for the Sea of Galilee. And so they were friends. And we don't hear a whole lot about Andrew, except that he brought Peter to the Lord. And then James and John, who were called sons of thunder, I don't know what that means exactly.
Well, they were ready to call down fire on people who didn't follow Jesus.
You've got to have lightning, you got to have thunder, I guess. Anyway, yes, Peter was given this leadership role, and we see him in the first 12 chapters.
Right, the first part of the book of Acts, almost half the book. He is the definite, prominent leader.
Along with John. Peter and John, even though they're not biological brothers, it seems like they have an affinity for one another in the Gospels and here in the opening of the book of Acts, Peter and John.
But Peter is a spokesperson, and then as you come to the point of Stephen speaking up and being hailed before the synagogue and finally accused and speaking out. Then Peter is not there for a couple of chapters and then shows up again.
6 and 7.
And in chapter 8, when the persecution spreads the Christians to Samaria, Peter and John again go to make sure that this is authentic, these conversions.
But Peter seems to do the speaking and deals with Simon, the so-called sorcerer.
Right.
And then he's also the chief spokesperson in dealing with Ananias and Sapphira. I think that's what, chapter 5. Maybe.
Yes, that's true, in 5, yeah.
So Peter is almost in every chapter in the first 12, leaving out chapters 6 and 7, where we have Stephen as the main character. And where is he operating? Well, we looked that up in those chapters to see, and he's in Judah, Jerusalem, and Samaria.
Until you get to chapter 9. And after Paul comes into the picture briefly, he's mentioned in 8, and then in chapter 9 is his conversion. And then finally, he's sent away because of the attempts on his life. And Peter comes back into the picture.
Yes.
And he's no longer in Jerusalem. He's over along the coast.
On the coast, but we can only place him from Acts in Caesarea Maritima, that is Caesarea on the sea, and points south down to the Gaza Strip area, in that area. So Lydda, as it's called in the New Testament, and Joppa, which is now where Tel Aviv is.
Yeah.
So he is operating both up on the mountain area, in the mountain area, Samaria and Judah and Jerusalem, but also on the Mediterranean coastal area.
That plain area.
Yeah, right, along the coast.
Well, that's where we pick up our text today.
Yes.
He's in that area.
So Peter has this leading role. We know that Peter was not confined here. There are 2 other places we know where Peter shows up elsewhere in the New Testament, not in these 12 chapters, but we know he showed up at Antioch of Syria because Paul refers to an incident where he and Peter kind of debated.
In Galatians, he talks about that.
But then we know from 1 Peter that he was in Rome, along with John Mark, who wrote for him. And so he did, in fact, move outside. And we know that John, his buddy, wound up at Ephesus.
And Peter's letter, that 1 Peter, is really addressed to the Christians in that area along the coast of Turkey.
Well, yes,
area.
Especially in the northern area and on the plain. So he was not stuck in Palestine, but he wound up in other places as well. So now we're going to have a story about him. It's a miracle story. And why don't you read the text, and then we'll talk about it.
Looking at Acts chapter 9, in verse 32, it talks about him visiting the saints in Lydda and healing a paralyzed man. And then in verse 36, in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which when translated is Dorcas, who was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydda was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, "Please come at once." Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Peter sent them all out of the room. Then he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning toward the dead woman, he said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called the believers and the widows and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon.
Okay, let's straighten a few things out or explain a few things.
Okay.
The name Tabitha is an Aramaic word and means a female deer, a doe, or a gazelle, if you want to get fancy.
Yeah.
And so what is there about a doe that you would want to name a girl after that animal?
Well, graceful, beautiful, and in English, a dear woman.
Oh, okay. So we're going to say that Tabitha was a deer woman, and was dearly loved.
Right.
Have we punned that sufficiently?
I think so.
Okay.
But she was dearly loved. That's significant here, that the church really was concerned when she got sick and died, to the point that everybody seemed to be affected, and 2 men were sent 9 miles away to another city to find Peter because they'd heard he was there.
That's right. That's right. Now, just for the record, Dorcas is Greek, meaning the same thing, a doe, a female deer. And so it's given to us in Aramaic. Now, in Hebrew, it's tzaviyah would be the word. And even men, I know some men who, Jewish men whose name is Tzavi, and that's the buck, the male deer. And so I think, though, of graceful and beautiful eyes, and an elegance, a certain elegance about them. One day, I think it was about 2 years ago, I went out into the side yard, and there in the lower part, on the side of a hill of my property, there was a doe, and that doe caught glance of me, and I wish you could have seen that animal racing to the top of the hill and out of sight.
Oh, they're so quick.
My, I've never, you're talking about moving fast. I was just stunned and almost put into a state of awe at seeing what this deer was capable of.
But this Dorcas, this dear woman in the church,
yes,
was known for her service, her faithful service.
Right.
Sewing as a seamstress, made clothing, and the people who were there showing Peter the clothing that she had made were testifying to her service as a Christian.
But look at here's another thing, we might just point out quickly, and that is, notice how the corpse, the body was treated. It was washed, and then it was put into fresh clothes, and then put in a room apart.
The upper room,
and in a special place. And I know in olden times, here in our area and in other areas of our country, it was not unusual for the deceased to be cleaned and dressed in the best, and then laid, as we said, as it was said, laid out at home. And then the people would come to commiserate and to give their sympathy to the home.
The wake in the home.
And then you get the wake, which is even bordering on a party in the presence of the deceased, as if the deceased in some way is still there and enjoying friends and family members in the joy.
Yeah. But this woman who was such a servant of the church was obviously dearly loved and deeply appreciated, and it makes us think about the fact that in that culture where women were not prominent and not paid much attention to, the church and the followers of Jesus and Jesus himself, his own example, made a difference in the culture.
Yeah, we need to talk about that. Why don't we save that and as a major issue that this tells us about, informs us of. Mm-hmm. Okay, they go and get him. He comes at once. Why would, let's pretend here for a minute that we can read their minds. Why would they think to send for Peter, as you say, 9 miles away? Mm-hmm. That was a pretty, you don't drive that in a car,
right,
or a chariot. You're probably in all likelihood walking. Mm-hmm. So they sent two men on a long walk, 9-mile walk, mm-hmm. to go get Peter. Why?
Apparently,
what difference does Peter's presence make?
The word was out. Minds? He had healed that man in Aeneas, the paralyzed man, had been healed, and yes. The word of that had surely gotten out. And I guess there was a hope that maybe Peter could do something. But of course, yeah. By the time you walk 9 miles and walk back 9 miles, time has lapsed, and they may have questioned whether much could be done.
Well, generally in those days, there was no embalming practiced among them. Mm-hmm. In fact, usually, I don't think embalming is used for Jewish people. Many times, I think it's their practice. So they tried to bury rapidly, mm-hmm. For obvious reasons that we don't need to go into. So it's going to take them how long to get there? Hours.
Yes, even a quick walk.
The good thing about it is it's not real steep ground. They have to.
Terrain is. Yeah,
the terrain is not totally level, but it's not really mm-hmm. mountainous either. They're going up the coast, and so they're going to get. I wouldn't be able to estimate how much time was taken, but it was, and then you got the trip back from Lydda to
Joppa.
Joppa and Lydda, mm-hmm. between them. So you got a round trip there. Mm-hmm. Did they go and come back in one day? That would really be pushing it.
It would be. It doesn't say.
And it may be that they did walk at night.
But you get the impression that Peter left immediately to come with them.
And it doesn't say that, but that's the way that the text unfolds, mm-hmm. that he is moving with them quickly. Mm-hmm. Again, what did they think his presence, what difference would it make? Maybe the story of Aeneas had circulated. Mm-hmm. Were they thinking, just maybe he would be able to do something for her even though she's dead?
Yeah.
Aeneas wasn't a corpse, but Dorcas was. Mm-hmm. And there's no question that she was dead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at least he can give us some support and some encouragement. Yes. His presence it would bring some sense of peace and tranquility to us. Mm-hmm. And they knew by this time the stories about Jesus' ministry and his mm-hmm. raising people from the dead. And right. Peter had been with Jesus and had done amazing things, healing the man at the temple gate in Jerusalem. Yes.
So what he had done other places, the stories were surely out. There might have been at least the glimmer of hope. Maybe yes. There's a possibility.
At any rate, it would be good to have him here.
Right, yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yeah.
So they brought him, and he went immediately. He did not pause. Mm-hmm. He went immediately to the upper room and fell on his knees, the NIV says, and prayed. It doesn't say what the words of the prayer are
right.
not provided. But then he turns to the corpse.
The dead woman, yeah.
And says, Tabitha kumi in Aramaic. Tabitha, get up.
Yeah.
And so she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. Mm-hmm. Just bingo like that.
And he took her hand, raised her up, took her to the people.
And helped her to her feet. And then he called for the believers, which means Christians, right? Mm-hmm. And the widows, and presented her to them alive. Mm-hmm. What a surprise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Surprise, surprise. She's alive. And this became known all over Joppa.
Oh, yeah.
And
And many people believed in the Lord.
This one act on his part then brought people into faith, mm-hmm. and they became Christians as well.
And today's lesson emphasis is faithful disciples. And I mean, what he did generated faith, but it's interesting that Dorcas's life and service had already generated faith and encouragement among the people in the church. The widows, some have thought maybe these were professional workers of the church or even professional mourners.
Well, we do know that later on, widows became sort of, I don't know if they were paid employees, but they were somehow or another supported by the church to do significant work.
In 1 Timothy that shows up, and that's next week's lesson in 1 Timothy.
Okay.
So that's a connection possibly, but we don't know.
And another question that needs to be raised, are these professional mourners? Now we know that in antiquity, frequently there were people who received pay, especially women who received pay for moaning and bemoaning and mm-hmm. weeping and so forth for the dead.
Those were the people that Jesus sent out of the house when he went to Jairus' home and raised the daughter.
Yeah.
The professional people who laughed at him when he said she's just asleep. But here's the situation where there are widows, and it sounds more like these are people in the church who've been blessed by her.
I think so. I got to tell you a funeral story. I had a funeral for a person many, many years ago, and it was in a church not my own, and a lot of the people that had come for the funeral, and the place was packed. I didn't know who they were, but there was a woman who came forward. They had the viewing of the corpse after the service, and so I was sitting there waiting for this to be completed so we could then get on with the burial. And there was a woman who came forward who took a look into the casket and then went, and then fell out. And they laid her out on the bench. After the service was completed, I asked the undertaker, I said, who was that woman that saw the corpse and just fainted? Is she a real close friend, a member of the family? He said, oh, no, he said, she's just somebody who came in, not related to the family. I said, professional mourner.
Yeah.
So I guess there's still some around.
But this, I was telling you earlier.
She attended funerals.
Did she?
Yeah.
This story reminds me of a lady I knew in Indiana who was a seamstress professionally, worked for Coca-Cola. She sewed uniforms for years, but was an active member of the church. After her husband died as a widow, she came to the church and was very actively involved. And the Ladies Missionary Society sewed layettes for a hospital in Africa, and she was not able to come because she worked. But she sewed at home and sewed more of those layettes than all of the ladies who came to the church and worked together. And when she died, the funeral service was one she said she did not want a sermon, she did not want a regular service. And so at the memorial, I simply read Acts 9, the story about Dorcas, and the testimony of a woman who sewed, and the people could testify.
What
He was a woman of faith.
Silent testimony.
It was.
She didn't have to talk about herself.
Right.
There's one thing that we thought about in studying this lesson and preparing it, and that is the care that Jesus had for the ladies and for women. Mm-hmm. And women followed him. And at times he was accused of being the friend of the wrong kind of people, and I think that included women. And he even took the part of a woman accused and caught in the act of adultery. You remember that? Mm-hmm. And it looks like in the early church, even with Peter and others here, that there is this concern for the welfare of women. They are in no way inferior to the men. They are welcomed in the church, and they are looked upon as being saints as well as any of the men.
Right.
And here is another example of that here with Dorcas. And I knew of one woman named Tabitha, but I don't know of anybody else named Tabitha. There was the girl on Bewitched, the daughter on Bewitched. I can't think of anybody else.
We have friends, and his sister's named Dorcas. And
well, what a name! What a wonderful name for a young girl, and with the hope that she will be as useful and as helpful to society as this Dorcas was.
It's really interesting that Jesus was such a trendsetter in contrast to the culture of the day, where women were not considered important and not allowed much prominence, much attention at all.
One rabbi even said, and this is in Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah, that talk not much with women. And one commentator made the comment, that refers not only to women outside the house, but it means also his own wife.
Yeah.
Isn't that terrible?
Yeah, terrible. And Jesus, besides the fact that there were women who supported his ministry, and there were, he was a friend to Mary and Martha. He talked with the woman at the well, which surprised even his own disciples.
And even pagan women.
And pagan women. And when he was risen from the dead, the angel told women to be the first evangelists and tell people he had risen.
Oh, yes, and the first ones to the tomb to find him risen.
Right.
Were the ladies who came to address the funerary.
And Philip's daughters were prophesying, which means they were preaching, they were proclaiming. So the church from the beginning has recognized the value of women and seen their importance. And that's part of faithful disciples.
Jesus taught them, and they learned that lesson.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah.
And on that theme, we'll conclude our discussion today. Thank you for being with us. And we hope that our treatment here of the lesson has been helpful to you. And we pray God's guidance and spirit upon you through this week, and we'll look for you next week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.